Good evening, everyone. My name is Tammy Jacobowitz, and I'm the director of Makom at SAR High School. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our second panel in the Makom series, Living Through Change, Institutional Self-Reflection in the Age of Corona. In our first panel a few weeks ago, we explored how the COVID experience has impacted education, what has shifted, how we have made different choices, and ultimately what we have learned about our priorities. Our speakers shared with us their dreams of what we might take with us as we continue to do the work of remapping, reshaping, and recreating our schools through the end of this pandemic and beyond. Tonight, we will explore another era of our lives that has been dramatically transformed and reshaped during this past year, our schools. Tonight, we are looking forward to being inspired by new ideas and possibilities to think about how we might reimagine what schools ought to look like, what we need from schools and from community in our new landscape. There is a lot of expressed and suppressed anxiety in our community around schools right now. Will we ever truly come back? What will we or should we come back to? Tonight is our night to dig deep into those questions. Before we start, I want to take notice of the fact that in our audience tonight, we no doubt have a wide diversity of attitudes and experiences when it comes to our relationship to shul and tefillah this past year. Among us are those who have not yet returned at all to in-person tefillah, but have benefited tremendously from online programming, including Zoom Minyan. Some of us have returned regularly, first outdoors and now tentatively indoors, stepping up in new ways to the responsibilities of communal prayer, davening, and laning. Within that group are those of us who have adapted to and are possibly even enjoying the streamlined service. And then those of us who deeply miss long drashot and communal singing, are happy to be davening in a minyan, but feel like something important is missing. Others of us have discovered that our tefillah is most vibrant and spiritually alive when we daven outside, alone on our couch, at our own pace, on our own key, or with our families, and we do not feel the tug of returning to shul. Some of us, long before COVID, never came to shul for tefillah at all and are sorely missing the social pieces that shul used to offer us, like Kiddush, that glorious institution, where we would connect in unplanned ways with members of our wider community. And the list goes on and on. We are all in this conversation tonight because we have all been shaped by our shuls. We all care about our shuls. In the last year, we have grown more aware as individuals what we miss about shul the way it was, what kind of tefillah we crave or seek, what sort of Shabbat morning schedule works best for our families. We have had more choice, more autonomy, and that's good. And there is good, important learning there that we should pay attention to. But this shul conversation tonight, just like the school conversation, is not just about self-discovery. There is a wider fabric at play. We are a community of individuals who rely on each other. I am delighted tonight to introduce our three panelists. Rabbi Shmuel Hain is a pulpit rabbi and educator. He's a rabbi of YOZ, a vibrant community synagogue serving North Riverdale and Yonkers. He is also Rosh Beit Midrash at SAR High School and co-director of Makom. In recognition of his integration of scholarship and the pulpit rabbinate, Shmuel was awarded the Daniel Jeremy Silver Fellowship at Harvard University for the 2020, 2021, and 2021-2022 academic years. Did I get that right? Dr. Gillian Steinberg is an English teacher and co-director of professional development at SAR High School. She is the author of 2 books about modern poetry and a dozen peer-reviewed articles about literature and pedagogy, in addition to pieces in popular publications ranging from the Jewish Week to the Washington Post. Gillian serves as president of the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale. Rabbi Yehuda Sarna is the executive director of the Bronfman Center for Jewish Student Life at NYU, university chaplain, and an adjunct faculty member at the NYU Wagner School for Public Service. He also serves as the inaugural chief rabbi for the Jewish Council of the Emirates. The program for tonight is we will start with one question that Shmuel will answer on behalf of the panelists, since there was considerable overlap. This is the question asking us to think about what has changed. And then there will be two other questions asked to all the panelists. At the end, we'll have time for Q&A. If a question occurs to you while one of the panelists are speaking, please put it in the chat, and myself and Simon Fleischer will be collating your comments for the Q&A at the end. Rabbi Haim, can you describe the changes that you have seen or overseen in your shul community over the last year, and the efforts your shul has made or efforts you have heard other shuls have made to keep things going?
Thank you, Tammy. Yes, I'm happy to answer that question. I want to thank Tammy and Simon for the opportunity to really think through these issues and to participate in this panel tonight. I also want to thank several colleagues, men and women who are serving in other Orthodox pulpits who have shared their impressions and thoughts, some of whom are on this Zoom tonight. And I'm also really looking forward to hearing from Gillian and Yehuda, who are two really insightful colleagues and leaders in the Jewish community. So let's talk a little bit about what has changed. And I'll try to reflect my experiences, and hopefully that resonates with some of the others. And I will also try to incorporate some of the other suggestions or thoughts of Yehuda and Gillian as well. We've all adopted to varying degrees over the course of the last 10 or 11 months what Yehuda Sarna called outdoors, online, and where we are needed most. And we've all built systems in areas that we were previously lacking, which can hopefully outlast the pandemic, which we'll get to in the other questions. For my shul, there were really two distinct stages. The first one when shul was shut, and the second was starting in June once shul reopened. So during that stage one, March through May, overnight we pivoted to become an active social services organization, assisting congregants in need, trying to reach out especially to members in higher risk categories, shopping runs, everything. All social and educational programming of the shul went to Zoom, including our shul dinner. And the truth is that whole period of time is a blur. But coordinating those small acts of kindness, and I heard this from members of my shul and from other members of the clergy, helping neighbors with shopping, tech support, phone calls, and distance visits to elderly members of our shul was really a gift to me personally. It helped me remain connected to individual members and to our collective membership. And it also really helped me cope at the time with a lot of trauma and fear that I was experiencing officiating at COVID funerals of members and family members, and having my spouse on the front lines at the hospital. Stage two, June to the present, our new normal. Once shul reopened, it seemed like it became all logistics all the time, facilitating as much adult and teen shul attendance as possible, minyanim, indoors, outdoors, high holidays, all while continuing the social services, especially for those not yet comfortable attending shul. We've had outdoor minyanim through the winter, thanks to some satellites with heat set up in their yards. But we really have not had young children. We've only had a handful of outdoor youth events, no kiddush, as Tammy mentioned, and that absence of Hamishkeit, which is a hallmark of our shul and so many others. We have shifted most of our learning back to in-person on Shabbat. And other than some special programs, I think that was because I and many others in the shul were zoomed out. But I think there are differences here between my experience at YOZ and a shul like HIR's, where Gillian is the president. Number one, the geography our location, our outdoor and indoor spaces really allowed us to open up services to almost all of our congregants. And we're located in a space where there aren't other shuls. So we've seen in some ways more attendance since COVID began and not less. We had more people for Yom Noraim than we typically have because we made it possible for people to be comfortable outdoors and indoors. And we really shifted away from Zoom, whereas shuls that have less space but have robust Zoom programming like HIR have maintained a daily deluge of wonderful programming, classes, special events, Kabbalat Shabbat, Havdalah, processing spaces, etc. In terms of our how the shul is doing, our members have really continued to support the shul. Some members, especially those working exclusively from home, have really been attending shul even more during the pandemic to have a social outlet. And other members who haven't been able to come are really supporting the shul financially, even if they're not using services as often. But I know that we are fortunate here, and I think there are a lot of colleagues, and there are synagogues in other places, even some in the tri-state area, especially I think those in New York City, that are struggling. And I'm appreciative of where we're at. And probably the most touching moment for me was Shabbat Shuvah, when the weather was nice and we committed to doing an outdoor Shabbat Shuvah drasha, seeing our entire community, over 100 people, come out for that experience was something that was very meaningful for me and kind of felt that community experience in the moment.
Thank you, Shmuel. Okay, our second and third question, we combine them. This is really the meat of tonight. And we're going to start with Gillian. The questions are, what have the experiences of the past year made you realize about what is truly important in shul life? And how will or should shuls reimagine themselves as they move into the post-corona era, and why?
Thank you so much, Tammy and Simon, for including me, and I'm really happy to be here with all of you. And many congregants and board members from HIR have joined as well. And I also just want to mention that our Rabbi, Rav Stephen Exler, is here, so thank you. And my parents joining from Buffalo, so nice to see you guys. Okay, so you know how you have those cousins with whom you would be friends no matter what because they're similar to you and you always have fun together? And then you also have those other cousins with whom you would almost certainly not be friends, but they're your cousins, so they're automatically part of whatever family thing is going on. So shul is the opportunity for that kind of family, the people you'd go out of your way to see no matter what, and just as importantly, the people you wouldn't see unless you were all part of some joint endeavor. I think right now I miss that second category the most, because they're the ones who are completely gone from my life right now. And I never fully appreciated them before because they were always there. But having those kinds of connections separates a shul from other social groups. And without a shul, we only have the friends we choose, not the people we wouldn't necessarily choose. And that's actually a really deep loss. I grew up in an extremely tiny community, and we had so few Jews around that we just loved every single one of them, even if we wouldn't necessarily have chosen them. Choosing just wasn't part of the deal. You couldn't afford to be standoffish with anyone because we were all part of this minuscule but important thing together. You couldn't shun or ignore any Jew because we were all integral to our oddball gang and always would be. We needed each other. And that led to a strange but very real kind of love. But in New York City, we don't need each Jew the way we did in Fredonia. So sometimes before COVID, I felt like I could pick and choose because I've got all the Jews I need and more. Sometimes I even felt like my shul experience was exclusively focused on those people who were part of my circle. I just see my friends and not think so much about people who were in my periphery, just perhaps as people in other circles wouldn't think particularly about me. But now that I'm away from shul, I see more clearly that what's most important about the shul community is that you don't get to pick and choose. That's actually maybe the best thing about it. So it's not exactly that I miss the people I'm not close with, but I miss that sense of the oddball gang, that we all do this stuff together because whether we like it or not, Am Yisrael, because every single person matters, because we have some set of values, spoken and unspoken, that we share and want to strive towards together, even when it feels like we disagree more than we agree. But frankly, if that were true, we wouldn't bother to try. The fact that we are trying to form these sometimes unwieldy, sometimes uncomfortable communities at all means that we implicitly recognize the value of broad concentric circles of connection. Since COVID, I'm readier to acknowledge that value more explicitly. My interactions with people outside of my group make me a better person than I think I'm naturally inclined to be. They make me see outside my otherwise carefully curated life. And that's what shuls do when they do it right. In terms of the specifics, just a few thoughts. What I hope that we'll continue and keep thinking about based on this year that we've had, I hope we can put less pressure on Shabbat morning. We've learned that we can make tefillah more streamlined. Shabbat morning services can, I think, feel bloated. But if we see Shabbat morning as only one small part of what we do, which of course it is, we can spread out some of our many obligations, discussions of social justice, announcements, multiple divrei Torah, smachot, singing, dancing, across multiple platforms, and not put so much weight onto Shabbat morning as the location for everything. I think we have to be more aware in an ongoing way of people with unique needs. There are many people who can't, for various reasons, be part of in-person Shabbat davening. This year, we've had our attention drawn to that issue, and we need to work to make sure that it doesn't slide back into the margins. We should maintain those networks of people that Shmuel was referring to. The errands and phone calls and meals and check-ins should be central to our identity as a shul going forward. HIR in particular has had a lot of geographic flexibility. We want people to be physically with us, of course, but we also love that HIR has moved so far beyond Riverdale, feels important to so many people everywhere, and we want to maintain those long distance connections. I think it's important to mention that lessening the obligations of halachic minyan by using Zoom have, maybe ironically, created more opportunities for women to be part of online tefillah in meaningful ways, and can allow us to look at new options for inclusion across a number of demographics. I've really appreciated the opportunity for Shiva visits from afar this year, and I hope that we'll maintain some mix of in-person and virtual Shiva and other life cycle events, which enables greater participation. From an administrator perspective, I think we can do the same with administration and leadership meetings, using Zoom as an addition to make it easier for people to be involved. And I guess I'll say also, as a closing to my remarks here, that we need some sensitivity. We have to remember moving forward that not everyone will just bounce back after being in the depths of the last year. I'm not sure precisely what congregants will need, but maintaining that awareness of people's needs is very important. Everything can't just become, yay, we're done, we're all fine again. Basically, shuls should now, as always, listen carefully to lots of disparate people who disagree about almost everything, but who want, despite the odds, to form a community. We have to balance and unify wildly different needs and personalities. I hope this reset will make us appreciate having everyone in the community more than we did before, and also allow us to meet as many different people's needs as possible. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gillian. Yehuda.
Well, it's great to have to be here, and I just want to say I'm so honored to sit on the same panel as Dr. Steinberg, Rabbi Hain. You know, besides for being good friends, you've taught my kids so well, and I'm forever grateful to you and all the other teachers who are here tonight. That being said, I really feel like still tonight I have an audience of two. My mother's on the line as well as my mother-in-law. So those are it's my main audience, and everyone else is invited to listen in. When Dr. Jacobowitz first approached me to speak on this panel, I said, I'm happy to opine. I'm not really a synagogue rabbi. And then but she said, well, talk about this minion that you started several years ago before the pandemic. And so hope you'll forgive me if my remarks are not so much about the reaction to the pandemic, but really what some of the things that I've been doing beforehand. And in as much as it might be helpful, I'll offer it for you here tonight. In many areas of life, the pandemic has served not as a game changer, but as an accelerator of inevitable change. Synagogue life and business of the synagogue are no exception. 5 years ago, I started a minyan for people in their 20s and 30s downtown. Now, there are other synagogues, great synagogues, in fact, in Lower Manhattan, and we didn't really want to compete with them. At the same time, we did want to create a space which was different, not just different, but not just serving different shuls, but really built on a different kind of model. Most shuls operate on a transactional model where there's a fee for service, there's an entry ticket. You become a member and you get stuff in return. Aliyahs, kibbudim, chulent, newsletters, burial plots, for many different shuls, many different things, but there's essentially that kind of model. There is a quid pro quo. You get stuff. And this model is absolutely necessary for communal life and must continue to exist. But what we were looking to do is to work off of a different model, one which I would call a transformative model. So we removed the entrance fee so that people could not think about their experience in transactional terms. Is it worth it? People didn't even ask that question. We raised enough money from a few individuals who believed and helped articulate the vision for a transformational model, where it was assumed that people would not become lifelong members, but quite the opposite. We treated our demographic as an opportunity to inflect the trajectory of people's lives during very pivotal times. These are people meeting their fellow travelers for life partners, having their first child, transitioning to parenthood, figuring out their professional lives, trying to fuse meaning with success. So to build a transformative model, we had to articulate with what kind of purpose did we seek to align. And we decided that at every single time we gathered, we would say what we stood for. Why were people coming? And they weren't coming because they paid for something and were here to get stuff. But at every single time we gathered, we said that we aspired to be an intellectually engaging, outward-looking, and spiritually uplifting community. Every single time, to the point where it even sounded ridiculous. But it would be impossible for anybody to come through and not know exactly what we stood for: intellectually engaging, spiritually uplifting, and outward looking. No one could complain that they weren't getting their money's worth, and no one really expects to be in our community for life. But after a while, they did begin to expect us always to be in their hearts. Here are some of the things that we instituted 5 years ago, even before it was pandemic trendy. And I'll share these with you. And then I'll talk about a little bit about what this required on behalf of our community leadership. Number one was a disencumbered service. So even 5 years ago, we said no Sukkot Zimra, no Chazar Hashatz, no Anim Zmirot. Number two, though, is that we were always teaching. So at various joints in the service, we paused to teach. So you could say that we said less, but we learned more. And that balance, I thought, was very worthwhile. It was a worthwhile trade-off. Number three is that the design of the spaces that we were in were intentional, even jarring, but purposely. We placed the Aron on the women's side of the Mechitza, where it belongs. It was certainly jarring for more traditionally Orthodox, but also signaled to everyone that they were in a different kind of space. And so in the very design of the space that we were in, we had people asking questions. Number four, we didn't organize anything as a community that didn't meet at least one of those three criteria: intellectually engaging, spiritually uplifting, or outward looking. And that was something that we do with pride. So even if people came forward and they said, wouldn't it be great if we had a movie night, a bar night, whatever have you, I said, well, does it meet one of these three things? And if it's something that does, then we'll do it. And if it's not, then we won't. And the fifth is we always had a creative, almost playful style. So anytime, even as our community grew, we had 100, 150 people every Shabbat. We always maintained a custom that we started early on, which was that anytime there was any kind of variation in the letters of the Torah, big letter, small letter, a dot, the words fall on the page like an Az Yashir in an interesting way, we would call people up to the Torah to see. Realize the Torah is an undervalued artifact. People don't have an opportunity very often to see, to hold, to touch, to look at up close. And we use the art of the Torah letters themselves as a teaching tool. In fact, over the course of the pandemic, when we were sending out Divrei Torah over Zoom, the person who led our creative teaching about the letters has completed every parsha and is, God willing, putting together a book with commentary on the difference in the letters. Now, let me just say a few words about what this required on behalf of our leadership. So number one, it required, it's not easy, it required to be able to state why this was important for other people besides for ourselves. So we all know many shuls start because someone has a fight, they don't like it, they didn't get a thing, they felt offended, so them and their friends go somewhere else where they feel they can run it their own way. Or enough people move to, just far enough that it's really out of convenience. But what we really wanted to do was to distill a sense of purpose, a sense of mission that would speak to people to the point where they say, this is not just something that I'm doing for myself out of convenience or out of self-dignity, but self-pride, but this is something that I believe in so much, I want to help provide it for other people. Second thing is that once we had down what it is that we wanted to achieve and we believed it was important, what we did is we went to people with philanthropic capacity and said, you believe what we believe, and how about offering us some support in order to enable other people to experience that, to have this transformative experience. The third thing was, given our mission, we always wanted to provide top-notch content. I learned early on, even though I planned to speak every other Shabbat, sharing with Dr. Michal Biton, what would happen is that when I would speak, we would have X number of people, but when she would speak, it was X plus 25%. And I could tell the people were voting with their feet. So I was more than happy to just get out of the way and have Michal speak off. And she's just a phenomenal leader and mind and orator. The fourth was to constantly introspect, scan the environment for opportunities and challenges constantly. And that was certainly exhausting on the part of our leadership. It is in an ongoing way. The fifth thing is that we don't really have a board, and we are constantly consulting and asking people for their advice constantly. I mean, very sophisticated mechanisms for gauging people's interests, but at the same time, realize that sometimes for the purpose of efficiency, effectiveness, and minimizing kind of politics or infightings, the role of a board in really creating, designing transformative experiences, those functions sometimes just better left to educators and rabbis. Number 6, constantly repeat the story, the narrative, and the grander purpose, even if it sounds ridiculous. Just to say over and over again why it is that you're here. And number 7 was to lead no two life cycle events the same, because the people are different and what they're looking for is different. The journey is different. And to always, we would always have that pressure. We would always ask ourselves before we engaged in any life cycle event, not just in the lives of individual, but even in the lives of our minyan, like a dedication of a Sefer Torah, something like that. we would say, well, what are we going to do differently? But how are we going to do it differently this time? So those are my remarks. I know that they're not directly related to the pandemic, and again, there's no substitute for the mainstays of Jewish community, which have to be built for sustainability purposes on a transactional model, but also the need for a non-competitive entity that kind of goes between, which is able to clearly enunciate why it is that people should join, realizing that it gets people at a certain moment in their life, which can be an inflection point for the trajectory of what still is to come.
Thank you so much, Yehuda. That was phenomenal. Shmuel, questions about, yeah, go ahead.
And I'm going to repeat the questions just so that we refocus on the specifics. The first of these two questions is, what have the experiences of the past year made you realize about what's truly important in shul life? And then follow-up is, how will or should shuls reimagine themselves as they move into the post-corona era, and why? And I want to pick up a bit from where Gillian left off, and also inspired by Yehuda and kind of articulating what the grander purpose of the shul is, hopefully be true to that as well. The pandemic has taught all of us, I think, that you can find a lot of what shul does elsewhere. You can daven at home, and that's religiously meaningful. You can find a backyard minyan. You can zoom into some other shuls, Kabbalat Shabbat, listen to lots of shiurim and classes online. You can get involved in social action or chesed projects. You just need a good WhatsApp group. But what good community shuls do uniquely possess and create is really the chance to be a part of a diverse, multi-generational, caring religious community where we support one another and where we learn from each other, where we have inner circles, but also many outer circles. And I think what Zoom has been really useful for is classes and for an occasional larger group gathering. But Zoom does not recreate the magic of social serendipity that a fully functioning, vibrant, in-person shul community provides. And that's what I miss the most. Sherry and I talk all the time. We miss being community connectors. We miss spending time at Kiddush and Shabbat meals with congregants and friends, and getting to know new members and inviting them over and introducing them to other families and their kids, and seeing how those relationships develop. And in truth, that's going to be my focus moving forward. And the thoughts that I'm going to share now are somewhat tentative. We're still in the eye of the storm here somewhat, and still feeling our way through things. And one of the thoughts that I have about going forward is just that I'm worried about all the people who've experienced personal loss before and during this traumatic time, and how the pandemic has complicated their grief. And we don't yet know what the after effects of that will be. And having missed out on many of the rituals of closure we're accustomed to, shuls need to think about alternative ways to help mourners make that imaginative leap that death, especially during this pandemic, requires of the living. So I'm going to share some tentative thoughts on potentials of reimagining, but I'm also going to share some of my fears in the hopes that naming them will help me and others to allay some of my concerns. So in the next few months, we're in the middle of building a new shul, and the pandemic has really pushed me to think much more deeply about ways that we can maximize our new space to foster the magic of social serendipity. And I think being active in a true community synagogue is really critical for all of us. This is just to reformulate a bit what Gillian said. I've been thinking a lot about weak ties in contrast to close ties. And weak ties is a term that was coined in 1973 in an important paper by the Stanford sociologist Mark Granovetter. Weak ties are those acquaintances, the cousins you wouldn't be friends with, the people you are friendly with but you're not close friends with, the coworker who you make small talk on the elevator with, the woman who sits in the row behind you in shul. Close relationships were always thought to be the essential component of human social well-being. But research has shown that really casual friends and acquaintances are as important to our well-being as family, romantic partners, and close friends. Much of our energy during COVID has really been spent on staying connected to our families and closest friends, and I get that. But as a consequence, those weaker ties, those relationships have withered. And that's a problem, because as the pandemic has evaporated those outer circles, the outer categories of friendship, it's also depleted so many of the joys that make up human life and buoy our health. So reconnecting with our weak ties is the real opportunity and challenge of this next phase of the pandemic. And I think if we focus on that challenge, we'll be able to offset another potential loss that I really fear from this pandemic, and that my colleague, Rabbi Noah Chesses, who I think might be on this Zoom, shared some of these thoughts with me as well. I'm worried about the disintegration of kind of a communal ethic. Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind contrasts that communal ethic, where you make decisions based on what's best for the group or community, with an autonomous ethic or a divine ethic. And because we've been in survival mode during the pandemic, we've operated almost exclusively out of that autonomous ethic, thinking about the choices we've made for who we spend time with or where we daven, or the difficulties in inviting people to a simcha during the pandemic, and how invariably that tightens the inner circle and frays our outer circle. But the truth is, I think the pandemic, like Yehuda said, has just accelerated some of the trends that were going on in America and much of the Orthodox community pre-pandemic. Before COVID, it was already countercultural to be community-minded. And it's remarkable, and it takes a lot of work, that there are communities out there like HIR, like Yehuda's downtown community, that have cultivated a communal ethic in the face of this pervasive autonomous ethic. But I'm worried after this pandemic about the diminishing of this communal ethic in our circles as well. I'm confident that people will come back to shul, but I'm worried that they'll only invite their closest friends over to their homes for Shabbos meals. How can we, in the spirit of communal consciousness, really build up the weak ties and make them even stronger? That's where I think shuls need to reimagine their role and play a larger role going forward, during services, via programming, classes that reconnect people, potluck meals, bingo nights, all kinds of different speed dating kiddushes, all kinds of different programming ideas come to mind. And hopefully shuls can help people realize that they miss and need these more peripheral relationships. I think that's our shul and our community's true challenge going forward.
Thank you very much to all three of our panelists. You really gave us a lot to chew on, and we're only going to have time right now to tug on a few of those threads. And I want to start with one that really jumped out at me. And I'm going to ask this question to specific panelists. I'm going to sort of choose an order, but I hope you'll all feel comfortable weighing in. So Gillian, you observed in your remarks that the narrowing of our social circles as a result of the closure of our synagogues during the pandemic was and is a really deep loss. And then Shmuel, you started to pick up on that also and seemed to agree. And I'd like to hear more about this sense of deep loss that we feel with this narrowing, and ask you to invite you to say more about this loss. Is this about our ethical and religious responsibilities and what we gain from serving others? Is this loss more directly personal? So again, Gillian, if you'd like to begin, and then maybe Shmuel and Yehuda can weigh in afterwards.
I guess I haven't thought about it in those terms exactly, but I think it's personal leading to ethical, right? Like the personal connects to the ethical on this larger sense. And it's sort of what I was saying about how I think having that broader community, as Shmuel was just discussing, it makes me a better person than I have to be otherwise. Like when we're confronted by difference, we have to face the resistance in ourselves and then figure out how to move past that. And when I'm only choosing the people with whom I spend time, I never face that resistance, or not in the same way. And so I think that there's a very small interpersonal kind of moment that leads to a whole larger introspection and a sense of self as part of a larger whole that just feels very important to me and that we don't have right now. I think we can replicate it to some degree if we participate in some of the ways that the shul has tried to maintain connections. So, for example, the phone calls system, right? If you're assigned to call someone whom you don't know, just because you volunteered to make phone calls, then you're starting to create some of those connections again. But I think when we're all in a space together, there's just a different way that happens very naturally, that can lead to a larger, I think, communal and individual ethical sensibility that feels very important to me.
Shmuel, would you like to pick up on that?
Yeah, I agree completely with Gillian and think that she's much more articulate than I am on this and many other things. And she speaks in full paragraphs and sentences, even when they're not pre-prepared remarks. But to me, a story always comes to mind in thinking about it. And it really goes back to that weak ties and kind of the human health. I think there's so much that we don't realize in that the opportunities that are lost in those connections. When I first came to my synagogue, I happened to know another person in our synagogue who had previously had a kidney transplant. And within a few months of being in the synagogue, someone in the shul developed kidney failure and was about to get a kidney transplant. Now, they weren't friendly at all, but because I knew they had this in common and they were coming to a shul together, I put them in touch with each other, and that spawned a deep relationship, and they connected with other people in the Riverdale community who had donated kidneys or received kidneys, and it just begat a whole chain, a virtuous cycle of doing good and connecting people, and I'm not sure if that's personal or ethical or physical or emotional, but all those things come out of that magic of social serendipity and that the weak ties relationships that we form. That's just one story that I always think of, but multiply that by dozens and hundreds of stories like that when you just bump into people at shul.
Yehuda?
Look, I think that this is something that we will succeed at. We will succeed at recalibrating. We will do that. What worries me, on the other hand, is the way the recovery from the pandemic is really going to increase, magnify, or accelerate the socioeconomic realities that already, and I'm not saying anything that everyone here is not already aware of. I mean, one of the reasons why, generally speaking, modern Orthodox synagogues have been able to sustain themselves and institutions is that we were not, given the professions that we're in generally, we're not in the areas which were decimated by the pandemic. I mean, the unemployment rate roughly twice as high as what it was a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, but not in the areas that affect our institutions. And the fact is that we are going to recover as a community, not just faster, but significantly faster than other parts of America. And I think we need to bake that in to the DNA of our own recovery. What is our responsibility as a result of that accelerated recovery? We may even be better off afterwards from a financial standpoint, from a philanthropic standpoint. A lot of people with a lot of money have not been spending money, have not been able to spend money the way that they usually do. And they actually have more philanthropic capacity than before. And that's not just about, Jeff Bezos. It's about, many people who came into the pandemic with philanthropic capacity have even more. So I would say that is the challenge that we need to really be aware of. Not just how do we recover as institutions, but how do we recover as neighborhoods or as cities? In what ways is bringing about a renewed neighborhood ethic, which can be taught, which can be explored? Because I think that we have more of a responsibility than we did a year ago.
Yuda, I'm going to stay with you now for a minute, if that's okay. I want to pick up on something that a terminology that you introduced to our conversation tonight and ask you to sort of respond to it. And then I have a follow-up in regard to that terminology for both Shmuel and Gillian. So this is a two-part question. So here's your part. You distinguished between shuls that operate according to a transactional model and a transformative model. So I'm wondering how this distinction guided you in leading your synagogue community during the pandemic, and whether you think there's a way in which this model might inform more mainstream synagogues and their thinking about their post-pandemic future.
Well, look, Mr. Fleischer, one of the things that I very much inherited from my parents was storytelling and story listening and hearing things, seeing things, processing things in terms of stories. And I couldn't help reverting to that in the way that I, lead the communities that I lead, and in enabling as many people as possible to see their life in narrative terms. And especially with the young adult population, this is really one of the very first chapters that they are self-authoring. And the question really becomes, what is in this opening chapter for them, or second chapter? Is it a story of how something happened to them? Or is it a story about how they responded to something that was happening around them? And what I tried to teach, and you could say this is too theoretical, but I feel like this is halacha l'maaseh, is to do the kind of things, not to do the kind of things that in a way set the stage for the rest of your life. This is era defining. This is life defining, the moment we're going through. Do you really want to have the kind of storybook which looks back at this time and sees inaction, sees paralysis, sees the inability to move as a result of fear or uncertainty? And look, New York City was hit very, very, very hard. And we don't. Most people live here don't have backyards, don't have, there's, it was very, very tough. And the things we saw, even just looking outside our window on 23rd Street and 3rd Avenue, created opportunities for teaching for our kids and opportunities for learning for ourselves virtually every day, and especially during the heat of the pandemic. But that would be the thing that I would say. So look, we weren't always able to meet, and we weren't always able to Zoom, and wasn't always great. But to a certain extent, the way I see it, and I'll leave you just with this thought, is that it's not like shul became shorter. It's actually shul became much longer, because what people are really looking for from the sense of community to which they belong is, how are we dealing with this over the long arc of this past year? What is the big story here? The shul moments, the services, these are just, those are just points. But really what they're looking for is help me tell the story. Give me the story. Help me understand. I love what Shmuel said about, from this time to this time, we operated under this thing, and then the shul reopened that. And I found as I'm working with different people to tell their stories, whether it's my staff, whether it's college students, whether it's young professionals living in the area, is that everybody has a different periodization. Rabbis very much defined by the opening and closing of shuls. But for so many people, it really just depends on who can you depend on and who depends on you. And those two factors really ended up determining the externalities of what people were facing. But ultimately, there's a strong self-authorship component.
So I'm going to continue on this dichotomy between transformational and transactional shuls. And I want to ask Shmuel and Gillian, in your capacity as shul leaders, is there some way in which you can imagine this dichotomy might be useful to you, either conceptually or practically? Shmuel, you want to start there?
Sure. I think even before this pandemic, all schools were reevaluating this, and that language of transformational and transactional and millennials and their willingness to go along with the traditional model of shul membership has been a major discussion. I think for our shul, the transformational piece is really thinking about how we take the best stuff that we've learned about ourselves and our community during the pandemic and bottle that in a way that propels us forward. And I think some of that is kind of the grassroots piece that has emerged, which has helped us have 5 different high holiday services and more people participating and more people being active. And again, not looking at it as what am I getting from the service, but what can I contribute? What can I participate in? How can I help make this service happen and make the shul run? And to me, that's really where the transformational versus transactional, piece comes into it. JFK's, inauguration line of, what you can do for the shul and how the shul can be a place where you contribute and transform yourself through that contributing. I really do feel like the people who have been active the most during this pandemic and have put themselves out there from an emotional standpoint have also been able to thrive or stay intact despite some of the trauma, because those acts of giving are transformational. And so to me, that I'm not looking to blow up the model, and I know Yehuda's not suggesting that, but for me, the transformational piece is really in how people achieving what Yehuda's doing in terms of how people look at their participation in a community, but maybe saving the baby while getting rid of some of the excess water along the way. Mixing metaphors.
I'm still stuck on JFK's remarkable comment about shuls. Gillian, would you like to weigh in on this?
Sure. It's a hard question for me to answer without making it too specific to the HIR, which is a very unique place. And so I would say we're always kind of skirting that line, right? But I think that we are sort of in our essence transformational, but you may see it a little bit less now than over the years leading up to now, because HIR was a first for so many things. That is, it wasn't just transformational for HIR. HIR transformed modern Orthodox shuls in many ways. And so I think that it's really important for us to recognize too, that like we're now kind of in the middle of a model that exists, but it exists as like we exist in the middle of it because we were at the front of it at one point. And so all of these kinds of experiments, again, I don't want to take credit for too much stuff, and none of it had to do with me personally, but like the shul itself was just at the forefront of so many things in terms of thinking about inclusion, having free high holiday services. Like that's a thing you can find all over the place now, but you couldn't always, right? But you always could at HIR. And so I think it's really important, but I guess the way that I want to envision it is as a series of small steps. So not a rupture from one kind of model to another, but a gradual growth and transition. And the best model for me to think about that is our transition from Rabbi Avi Weiss to Rabbi Stephen Exler. And I think that's the kind of thing that can tear a shul to pieces. When you have a really popular, nationally, internationally known, charismatic, forward-thinking leader, and that leader retires, like the fact that our shul somehow transformed from one leader to another and has gradually shifted, and it was seamless. that's how I like to think about that idea of transformation. Is like it can happen gradually over time and you become something new without having to blow anything up to get there. It's very hard, and it takes incredible good intention and hard work from all of the people involved. But I think if we can do that, then we have the possibility to sort of always stay at the front of what we're thinking about is next and important without losing all of the things that we value so much. And I would also say, I guess, just in terms of that transactional idea, that we've always been a place that welcomes all comers. And I know every shul does and says that. And I think we try to live it in a really powerful way. And I always want to remind myself of that, because there may be moments where we fall short of that ideal, and the idea of welcoming everyone across level of observance and knowledge and background and socioeconomic status and sexual identity and race. And like, we really want that to be like what this place is, and not because anyone's giving us anything in return. And so we're like very open about dues structures and things like that. And I think that that's also a way to have that very sort of conventional large shul with a building and a capital campaign and all of the things that go along with having a shul, and not feel that it's so transactional all the time, that there's space for absolutely everyone, regardless of what that transaction might be.
Wow, thank you all so much. Before we leave tonight, and thanks to the audience for sticking with us, one last question. We began this panel by kind of taking a tour through all the different kinds of people in our community and where they've been davening or not davening, or coming or not coming. And I want to ask you, as rabbis and lay leaders, how are you prepared, or how are you responding to the phenomenon of those who have not returned at all to shuls, or aren't necessarily interested in doing so when shuls fully reopen? Is reaching out in some format your obligation? And if so, what is the nature of that obligation? Is it social? Is it religious? Or is it institutional? Gillian's nodding, so I'm going to say, why don't you go first?
Sure. I mean, I would just say it depends what you mean by return to shul. If you mean return to Shabbat morning services, I would always want to check in with everyone who had used to be a regular and isn't coming to Shabbat morning services anymore. But I hope we can think so much more expansively than that and say return to shul, be part of the shul can mean 1,000 different things. And we just have to keep that in mind. We always say every Shabbat in HIR, I say, look around the place where you're sitting. If there's someone who's usually there that you don't see today, please check in with them after Shabbat. I love that. But how many people are never sitting there, right? And so we're not looking to the left and looking to the right and then checking in with them. And I think that's how we have to think of what it means to return to shul. If someone returns to shul by just returning to our Israel Action Committee, that is like such a meaningful return to shul, even if they're not coming to davening, or returning to our social action committee, or returning just to come to a lecture or a program, or to walk by and, get a meal when we're doing our free Shabbat dinners, or whatever it is. So I think we just have to think very expansively about that and not be so narrowly focused on one event, one weekly event, as like what return to shul means.
Shmuel, you want to weigh in?
Sure. I'm sorry to take a minute. I'm awed by both kind of Yehuda's groundbreaking, trailblazing path. There's a lot to think about, but I do have to say, and Gillian knows this, and because we talk about it almost every day at school, and Rav Steven knows this, just the work that HIR does and kind of the mission-driven operation that they are is just incredible and aspirational for like the little shul that we are, and we benefit from that, being a part of that community, and really just hearing Gillian talk about it has reinforced how special a place that is. To get to your question, Tammy, yes, I feel lots of responsibility to reach out. The size of our shul is such, and like I said, there's that many of our members have come fairly regularly to shul. And so connecting and reaching out and texting and calling and being in touch with those who haven't has been a real priority of mine and our lay leadership. And it's for all the reasons. It's for personal, friendship. It's for, religious connection, and it's for institutional. We do an annual Mishloach Manot campaign, and I was worried that, this year people haven't been in shul, but it's one of those things where maybe this is transactional. We have more people participating in our Mishloach Manot campaign than we've ever had before. And I think it's because people miss each other. And this is a token way to kind of be on the list of people who are Purim heroes who want to give Mishloach Manot to everybody. And so my sense is, like Yehuda said, we're going to get through this. And my sense is also that people are still feel connected in our shul, to our shul, and we have to figure out ways that they can feel transformed by our shul moving forward. And in doing so, they'll come back in different ways and dipping toes and coming to shul or going to a lecture or just participating in Mishloach Manot. But like Gillian said, those are all great, and those are all ways to reconnect. The people that I'm really sad about are the people who moved into our neighborhood this year and who haven't experienced a normal shul in any which way. And those are the people who really have had a hard time this year.
I'm friendly with this evangelical megachurch pastor. His name is Bob Roberts. And he said to me, I said, how'd you do it? How'd you build these big churches? He said, listen, we don't build big, Texan accent, we don't build big churches. We church neighborhoods. And he said, the way we choose what we do is we'll look in a certain state and find the neighborhood that is the worst off, the neighborhood that everybody has ignored and is in everybody else's shadow, and we'll say, we're going to bring the light of God to that neighborhood. And I think there's a certain wisdom to the neighborhood approach. Sometimes it's difficult within the confines of any one institution, and yet there are realities that rabbis are hired by one institution, and also that lay leaders are committed to the development of one institution, and naturally there's a certain kind of competition between shuls in the same neighborhood. But I think ultimately it's about a neighborhood vision. It's about a neighborhood vision, and so of course, if there are people who don't yet feel connected, but who could be, of course. And sometimes it's about creating a shadow brand or starting another little shul or someone's basement or someone's backyard. Whatever works. I mean, we have an obligation as religious leaders, whether as ordained or not, we have an obligation to ensure that as many people as possible can feel a sense of home, a sense of belonging, a sense of connection, and kind of find meaning in community with other people. So I would say, Dr. Chkowitz, to your question, absolutely we have a responsibility. And I would say that we have even a greater responsibility than we had before the pandemic.
Thank you so much to all of you. When Simon and I first identified the arenas that we wanted to investigate in this panel, and the shul came to us very clearly, we were nervous to talk about the shul in a public forum. I was frankly nervous it would be too sad. And I'm feeling the opposite way from hearing the three of you tonight. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot of good ideas. My head is buzzing with possibilities. And you've shifted the focus, you've pivoted for us from sadness and a feeling of loss to a realization that we have an opportunity now to be more intentional maybe than we were before, and to really think, all of us, not just rabbis and lay leaders, but community members, What kind of praying lives do we want? What kind of activism lives do we want? What kind of relationships do we want with our neighbors? And the shul is so unique in all the ways that you've identified. It gives us those opportunities that we don't have in schools and we don't have in our homes. I hope that you will join us all for our third and last panel of this series on Wednesday, April 21st, where we talk about the home. The title is Family Matters, Remapping the Home in the Age of Corona, where we'll be thinking about all the ways in which our home lives and our family lives have been affected as well. And I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Gillian, Shmuel, and Yehuda. And thank you, Simon.